Hello guys, it's Furtis here and welcome to 3D Mutiny. In this video, I'm going to share with you the techniques I've picked up in the industry for making hand wraps and bandages. 3 unique methods, so making the cloth wraps themselves, the annoying bit in between the knuckles, and also leather binding that you can wrap around the hand. By the end of this video, you should have the confidence to make interesting hand wraps and know which one is best for your project. Okay, so here's an example of a production character, and you can see there's a lot of examples of different wraps. Maybe they're cloth, maybe they're leather. And on this one, they all use different techniques because they all have different outcomes and requirements. Maybe some will be used in the future, so they require things like IMMs or to be made in Blender or Maya. Others are a bit more painterly, so they're sculpted from scratch. So there's really quick techniques we can go through on how to do that. And in other examples, there are a lot of time-saving techniques through duplication and managing to put in a lot of detail without having to resculpt it each time. So I'm going to show you the 3 workflows surrounding that. Okay, so I'm just going to select a hand so we can practice on it. Stage 1, we're off to a good start. It's already pretending to crash. Quite scary with the big projects because they can crash at any time. It's quite a lot of data. So here what I did, I went to the lower subdivision, masked the arm, came down to split and split by mask points. You can see it's in the subtools here. Usually what I like to do is just press copy, find a new project like a cylinder, and then we can paste that subtool in here. So it just gives us a nice little clear scene to work in. So really good for practicing. I'm going to do the same, just get rid of one of the arms. To make a couple of copies of this, I'm just going to duplicate 3 times. So the first method of doing wraps, and this can be for stylized characters, usually quick and dirty, and you don't mind actually going through and sculpting each individual wrap. You're going to come to the mask and then change that to mask lasso. Just select the area that the wrap's going to cover. It won't matter too much because you can always adjust this after with move. In the subtools, you can come down to extract, and what extract does, and you've probably seen it in different videos, it's going to give us a preview of a secondary mesh, and this has an actual physical thickness, almost a bit like cloth. So sometimes people like to use it for t-shirts, for example. You can change the thickness with the slider here, and I'm just going to change it to 0 for what we want to do, and then click extract. Now the important thing to note is that extract is only a preview, so when you move the camera it's going to vanish. Don't worry about that, so just come to extract, and then for the second phase you're going to press accept. So once that's done, you can see it's created a second sub-object. You can isolate that by coming to solo. It'll be in a similar place with your guys' UI design. And what it's given us here is basically a single-sided face. You can tell because the back face we can't see here, but when we move it, we can see it on the alternate side. And what we're going to do is turn this into a bit of a mummy effect. So basically cloth wraps that are all overlapping each other. So first we want to split this up into sections. Going to press Control and Shift and then click on this squared brush. And we're going to change this to a slice curve. So when you use the slice curve, it may appear that it's not working or things aren't happening. So with the slice curve, it's like any tool. You're just going to hold Control and Shift and then click and drag, and it's going to create this line which we can put a slice through. When you let go, it looks like nothing's happened, but actually under the hood, a couple of things are happening. So the way you can see that is if you press Shift F, that's going to bring you into the polyframe mode. And what it's basically done is it's split the 2 sides into 2 separate polygroups. Now the polygroups come with this quite annoying wireframe, which is frustrating because it gets in the way. If you want to turn that off, you need to find the polygroups button. It's going to be on the right side of your guys' UI. And there's a very faint line in the top left, and it's called line highlighted. You're just going to click that once and it's going to take away the wireframe. So we're just left with the colors. Now the aim at this point is basically to get the slice curve and start inserting these incisions. And as you can see, these wraps are starting to form. We're going to use that as a basis. One thing to note is that if you start from the left and then go down to the right, this little gizmo with the black gradient, I don't know if you can see it, but basically on everything on the side, the black gradient is going to turn into a polygroup. So basically what we're going to do is rotate this arm and use the slice curve to insert the wraps. So get a good couple of different angles with the brush, and also your camera is going to be important. I'd avoid extreme angles from the bottom. So if I give an example here, you can see that's not really creating the wrap we want. We're starting to get some weird modern art thing, which is quite funny. So don't make them too extreme. The nice thing with each one of these polygroups, you can then split them up further. The only downside to using this method is when you want to start to overlap certain wraps, it gets a bit difficult because you're splitting into multiple polygroups. And I'll show you a different method which alleviates that, and it's much easier. But this is just a very quick method of getting some wrap polygroups. So as we move on, I want you to get into good habits. So we're going to put each one of these into a separate folder. To do that, you can go and press new folder. Now, the reason I've done that is that at each stage, I just like to duplicate the asset so there's something to fall back on. So now we're working on this second version of the polygroups that we created here. Second stage, we're going to come into geometry and we're going to make use of ZRemesher. Now with ZRemesher, when we press this button as default, you'll see that it's given us some new geometry. We can bring back the lines by pressing the polygroups over here. And that's a really nice even quadded geometry that we can sculpt on top of. But what we're interested in doing is keeping this form and structure. So before you do the ZRemesh, you can come to keep groups. It's basically going to adhere to the polygroups that we made. And now what you can see is that we have topology, form and function that is following those groups or those wraps that we made. I want slightly fewer quads. So I'm going to come to half, click ZRemesher again, and basically what that's going to do is going to try and half this by the amount. ZBrush crashed. Maybe there's an autosave in the background. You can probably tell it doesn't faze me. I'm used to it. Usually what I say with ZBrush crashes is it's an opportunity to do something again with all the new knowledge that you know. So there can be sometimes a silver lining. Maybe we can make some better polygroup wraps and see where we could take it from there. Games educator here is like cancel all the autosaves because they take so long. It's like 150 mil autosave, so I just cancel them all. Okay. We survived the crash, this time with some improvements. You know, we've got some variance in thickness, some thick ones, some thin ones, and some angled. So maybe a blessing in disguise. So once we've got the geometry with the edge flow, we can do two different methods. The first one is using edge loops. So under geometry, if you come into edge loops, and then we're going to use this section called panel loops. So when you click it by default, what it's going to give you is some thickness. And this is baked in geometry, so it physically exists and you can adjust it. And it gives us options to play with the edge, so we can insert edge loops, have no edge loops at all, and also increase or decrease the variance of the thickness. So I suggest coming out of poly groups just so you can see things a bit easier. And then every time you press panel loops, you can press Ctrl Z and try a couple of different settings. Down here you've got panel loops count, and that's going to be the amount of edge loops that are applied. I usually go for about 2. I don't want too many. That's just going to be a more even surface to work with in terms of quads. So with these panel loops, we can make some observations. So all of these are one subtool, but fundamentally they're floating objects. So if we use something like move, they're all going to move together. And if we change the brush to something called move topological, it means that we can move each one of these wraps independently. So here's where you start to insert your overlapping and underlapping and just making it a little bit more interesting. Something you might want to do as well is to put these polygroups into subunits. So if you come down to polygroups, go all the way down to polygroups, and then you've got something called auto group. And what this basically allows us to do is when we press Control and Shift, and then we just tap on one of these, it's going to isolate it. So you can start to sculpt on it and potentially move it. Also gives you the option to mask it. So if you hold Control and tap on the canvas, it's going to mask what we have shown here. You can then go Control and Shift. It's going to bring back all the polygroups that we had hidden. And now we're basically protecting or masking that section that we isolated. So that's going to be a common theme with wraps. You basically can come Control Shift click, tap it again, is going to invert it. And from here, you can just start to hide individual wraps. And then once you've done that, Control Shift tap on the canvas, brings them all back. And now we've got a staggered effect where we can adjust each one individually. And the nice thing about this is we can now hold Control and then just tap off to the side, and then that's going to invert everything. So if you imagine that you've selected every other one or masked every other one, all we have to do is come in here and move the overlaps. Really quick effect, you know, give it some variance, give it some wrapping techniques, press Control and then just tap off to the side. Now we're working with the inverted versions. So it's kind of like a cool workflow where you can save selecting each one individually. I use the same technique for things like toes and fingers. Okay, so from here I'm basically going to use the move topological and that masking technique that we used just to create some variance, you know, some negative space where it's opening up, adjustments in the silhouette so you can see the physicality of the overlaps of the unwrap of the wraps. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. It's just for the demonstration purposes on the workflow. So really fast, we can get a cool effect for wraps. The only disadvantage to this is they're basically bandages. So it's a full entire loop. Maybe you're looking for something where it's a bit more of a single strand wrap that's coiling up. So you can't use a coiling effect with this strategy, but we're going to move on to different versions. Obviously, remember with this technique, Control and Shift, that's going to isolate one section. and then we can just use the standard brush to insert some noise and information to indicate that this is kind of like a tight wrap. I would just alternate between add and subtract, so holding Alt and the usual brush. Maybe you can put some damn standard in there as well. So nice thing about this is once you've sculpted on that wrap and given it quite a lot of details, I like to give it a decent amount of geometry so I can't see the quads from a distance. And once you're happy with that, it's important that it's going to be in a folder. So for example, I'll put this in a new folder. I'll call it mummy wraps. Now we can come down to group split, and because these are in polygroups that we created, once we click split, it's going to split these all into sub-objects. Now the benefit with sub-object is that we can select them and obviously duplicate it. Come to the move gizmo, just tap Alt on the surface, and now we can just drag and readjust this, so you can now start to introduce some overlapping, which is going to add to the effect, right? And then we can just position it after with the move tool. So we had our silhouettes and we put in some information, duplicated it to save some time, and now we're getting that layered effect, which is important when it comes to interesting characters. Now obviously there's a problem with this. We were focusing on making all the wraps and they're all in separate sub objects down here. Say I want to fit this back onto the character, would have been best to do that at the start, but I thought it'd be interesting to show you how you can basically go back on yourself quite easily with this workflow. So just come up to your folder, select the topmost one, and then you're going to come down to merge, and you're just going to click merge down a couple of times. You can see there's 14 here, so we're going to press it about 13 or 14 times, and just keep on tapping merge until all of those are connected to each other. And now we have basic functionality with the move tool. We can reposition this. So the cool thing about this technique is that all the subdivisions are saved, so we're not actually losing anything by attaching, splitting and reattaching different objects. So it's a really useful workflow to be used on, to be honest, a lot of things in character design. Be flexible when it comes to merging and unmerging things. Use that to your benefit in terms of moving things globally and then coming down and adjusting them one by one. You could also be really clever with this as well. You could just duplicate this one more time, and then obviously we've got a whole entire new set of wraps. So say for example this purple one, I can select the second version and I can just bring out additional wraps underneath that wrap. So you're adding all this complexity without having to actually physically sculpt every single wrap. Obviously there's going to be a little bit of duplication there, so it's your role as a character artist to just basically mix that variance up. But you can see how this can save you quite a lot of time. For the thicker ones, you know, you can use something like a pinch brush and then just stroke down the center. Obviously this one's affecting all the pieces on the side, so for this what I would do is I just press Control Shift, click once, that isolates the one I want, and I can just thin this up and reposition it how I like, and then press Control Shift and tap on the canvas to bring everything back. Okay, so very quickly we've got some sort of like cloth bandages, which is very useful. Okay, for the next arm I'm going to show you how you can make some knuckle wraps, and that is a bit more interesting because obviously we're dealing with different directions of wraps. I'm going to start with the same technique of splitting it up into polygroups and then using the duplication methods with move topological. I won't do the knuckles. I'll show you a cool technique that saves a lot of time when it comes to actually sculpting those. So I've split it up here into polygroups. From experience, what I've done is just split the polygroups of the fingers and also made sure that there's a leading edge that goes across the knuckles. There's obviously some dodgy polygroups on the tip of the thumb. Not too fussed about that because I can just delete that off or just duplicate something else from the lower section. Might be an idea to put an additional loop just around the thumb, and that means that I've got this additional loop that I can copy down and it's going to radiate downwards. Exact same method of Z remeshing with keep groups. So instead of panel loops, I'm going to show you the method that I prefer. Just gives me a little bit more control when it comes to things like Z remeshing, and it also ensures that we don't have that annoying thickness of a cloth. You know, sometimes when you're painting it might go accidentally on the inside. Similar workflow, I'm going to rename this dynamic wraps and then put it in its own folder. Because we've got polygroups, I'm then going to come down to split and group split. So it's a really cool workflow I discovered, and basically we're going to re-merge these now. Very similar to the previous way. So an interesting thing's happened. It's really defined the split between these two wraps. So if you go to move topological, we can now split these, whereas beforehand you couldn't. We're going to take advantage of that by using something called dynamic subdivisions. So under geometry, you've got dynamic subdiv, and when you toggle that on, it gives you a nice little preview. Very similar to panel loops in the fact that it gives us a thickness and a certain bevel of an edge. So down in the settings here, you can change the thickness, dial this up and down. And the reason I like using this over panel loops is that we can turn this off and on. So at any point we can actually reconstruct the geometry. We can even cut this in half, which can be quite useful. I'll show you how to do that. And also you can change the thickness. Say you're looking from a distance, you want to make some edits to the visuals. We can just come to this slider and change the thickness. Do other things like change the bevels and the segments, all similar effects with panel loops. If you don't want that smoothing effect where it starts to bow over, you can just change the smoothing subdivision. I usually change it to 1 just so I can see it from a distance. We also have the added benefit that when we turn off dynamic subdiv, we can just see the individual planes that we're working with. So super useful for bandages. For this, I'm just going to get rid of the knuckles. For that, I just Control-Shift, click, and then click it once more. I then come to split and split hidden. Just means I can have that off to the side instead of deleting it just in case I need it. Okay, so let's make these wraps briefly more interesting with move topological. So what I've done is just duplicated them and moved them around a bit. A cool thing with dynamic subdivision is that if you get this kind of wobbly effect, you can actually fix that by just using more ZRemeshes. You can still have dynamic subdivision activated because we haven't applied it yet. And if you come down to ZRemesh and with the selected object, just go ZRemesh, we're still keeping groups and doing it by half. And what you can see is it's almost having this smoothing effect and it's straightening out those wraps. So it's really useful to position all the wraps really creatively and messy, and then come back to the wraps and then just do, that's why I prefer to use the dynamic subdiv instead of using panel loops. We also have this added addition. So say for example, I want to create a split in this wrap. Let's do it on this thumb piece here. So what I can do is just mask a selection or the piece that I want to remove. I can then come to split and split mask points. And basically what that's done is it's given us 2 pieces. It's got the original here and then also the piece that we split off. And that might look a little bit like magic, but the reason we can do that is that, remember, dynamic subdivision is only a previewer. So what we're actually doing is adjusting the underlying geometry by removing all these quads. Post after the fact is giving it thickness. So really cool and powerful technique for creating wraps and bandages. And that's how you can get your twisting effect. Say you want your wraps to twist up the arm instead of completely looping. Now, when it comes to the knuckles, there's another cool wrap technique, really showing them all in this video. What you can do is create a loop like we did there, split it, and then just reposition it on top of those knuckles. And then you can sculpt it as well. I'll show you a cool use of simulation. So what I like to do is just come to append and then append a plane 3D. Now the plane 3D can be a bit elusive because it has a back face as well. So if you can't see it, just rotate it a couple of times and we're going to position it slightly the same. I'm going to look at the geometry with polyframes with the lines on. I'm just going to make it slightly long. I'll also use ZRemesher so there's nice even quads. And that's going to be important because we're using simulation, and simulation likes that even distribution of points. So that's going to help us. So what we can do under dynamics, if we dock this to the side with this little button there, we have all these features for physically simulating this piece of cloth. That's probably worth another video and I'll go into it later. But what I like to use is under transpose. So by default, you've got this transpose brush. What I want you to do is change that to transpose cloth. Now, the feature of transpose cloth is that when we start to scale and rotate it, you can see how it starts to introduce this random noise and information. And if you give it more geometry or more divisions, that's going to interact in a different way. So you can see the different variances it. Now, the cool thing about this is we can start to introduce folds. So say, for example, with the knuckle, because they start to go inwards, we can put these internal lines just with the normal standard brush. And already we're getting quite a nice, cool cloth effect. But if you come back to transpose cloth and now we start to rotate this, maybe go down a division so it saves it, folds in locations that we put the standard brush. So you can play around with this quite a lot. You can smooth out areas that you don't like or just smooth the thing entirely. So usually what I like to do is just have a bit of random noise information, like simulated information, and then position that in between the knuckle. So how I'll do that is just position it roughly near. And at this point, we can still use dynamic subdivision if we want to see the thickness. Basically why the tool was created was so we could use simulations, or Pixelogic did. Activate this and you can give it some thickness. Now, usually what I like to do is if you come in the move section, transformations, we've got something called a bend curve. And when you hit bend curve, you might have seen this on some of the hair demonstrations or clothing demonstrations of past. It gives us these 2 points. With those points, if you hold the orange orange cone, you can actually twist that. So that's very useful for, obviously, if you're twisting cloth in between the knuckles, that can be quite useful. So maybe we can give it a little bit of a twist here. Down the bottom, we have another curve resolution. We can just scroll that, and that's going to give us more points. And with those points, we can start to adjust the position of this cloth and give it the effect that it's going in between the fingers. So with each one of these points opposite to the twist orange cone, we've also got a grey cone here, and that's the scale. So basically what we can do is we can almost pinch the cloth, and of course that's going to be very useful for the center of the fingers. Don't worry that it's not super accurate, because you can always come after with normal brushes and then start to readjust it. But for this, we just want to get the generic shape where we can start moving the clay in between the fingers. So maybe you want to make a couple of duplications of this and have them all interact with each other. I'm just going to save time by accepting it and then repositioning and duplicating it again. So once you're happy with how it looks, like how it's simulated, you just want to come to the transformations and then press accept. So once you've pressed accept, might be an idea to duplicate that first so you can always come back to it. But now we've got the features of normal ZBrush where we can start to reposition this. So say, for example, we've got quite a lateral, we can have that leading up the side of the finger so it looks cool from the side, and then we can just go back to our original. So with these, you can really start to deform them and pinch them because we have that original information. It starts to give some quite overlap information. So here I'm going to make another one, but this time with less of a twist. Again, I'll scale it down in the center and then just position these. Add a couple of more curve resolutions so I can get a better curvature. What you can do is if you want to get a real simulation of stretch, you can just get these points and drag them all the way up. That's going to elongate the information that we put in. It's going to give that stretching effect, which is really cool. So you can really see how malleable this process is. If you want to tuck and lap things under, you can just increase the resolution further, and then we've got more points to play with. Nice thing about this is we can come back to gizmo mode, and with gizmo mode we can just duplicate, bring this to the side onto the next knuckle, press customize once again, and then we can come back into bend curve, and then you can just readjust it for the second set of knuckles. Once you're happy with it, press accept. Then you can further refine it, textured information, or maybe just remove any areas of repetitiveness. Good brush for this one is pinch, so just get the pinch and then go in between the fingers. So the third and final effect is actually one of my favorites, and it's how you make these additional accessories. So it could be used for anything. It could be used for hair, could be used for laces. A common trap that people go down is that they think that an IMM would be the best method to make this. The only thing with the IMM is that once you place them, you have to add all the details afterwards. With the process we're going to go through, you can basically detail it as you go and then save a lot of time with all that information. So to start, I'm going to come to append and pick something. For this, I'm going to use a cube. It's going to be like a little leather strap that we're going to use. And also remember to turn off transpose cloth, because otherwise it's going to act like a cloth. Now what I'm going to do is basically create a cross section of that leather. So you can scale it down. I'm going to come to Dynamesh, and once Dynamesh is activated, I'm just going to use the trim dynamic to give a bit of edge wear and a bit of variance. So try and fit this as closely as possible to your leather straps. They might be different. For example, on the front side of leather, sometimes what you have is the skin is protruding. So usually what I like to do for that is get the damn standard hole dot, and it creates this nice effect. Once you've got that, what you can do is use H polish. With the H polish brush, you can just flatten this surface and it gives it the front skin of the leather, which has a nice effect. And you can come in here and give as much information as you want. Maybe a couple of scratches might be good. Again, you want to make this as generic as possible and as repetitive as possible, because we're going to duplicate it a lot. So there we have sort of like a generic leather strap that we can duplicate across. So next I'll come to the move gizmo. I'll hold Control and drag upwards. Now I don't want to realign it just yet. I'm actually going to move the geometry itself for the alignment. Once that's done, I just use Dynamesh again, and that's going to merge it all together, and then I'm going to fix up the seam in the center. At this stage, you're now going to put your second layer of variance in there. So here we can add just a couple of mix-ups. For this, I'm just using the damn standard still and defining that little edge. It won't actually matter that much, because when we're duplicating, it's going to be zoomed out quite far. Wherever I see repetition, I also just want to get rid of that. So maybe just something like a smooth. Most of the texturing work here should really be done in substance, even the surface texture detail. And you're going to repeat that process a couple of times until you've got this generic leather lace that you're happy with. For bridging the gap, what I do is I just add some longer strands that go all the way down. And this process is exponential. So we're basically squaring every time we do a duplication. So do the doubling enough times and you can actually get a very, very long strand of leather. Don't want to make it too long. I just want to wrap it around, maybe twice around the hand, hide the tips in intelligent ways. So once we've got that little strap, what we can do is come back to customize and use bend curve, one of my favorite features. And with bend curve, you want to start really low and somewhat make this circular shape. When you've got that generic bend, you can come to the curve resolution and then just scroll that up. And what we're aiming for is a complete circle around the character's hand. You want to evenly distribute all these points so there isn't too much deformation. So it will deform, but to get rid of the deform, you just have to align these nicely. You can see it basically fixes itself and more smooth the curve is. Good idea for this one is to come out of perspective mode, and that will make it easier to finalize one of these circles. Also remember, we can come to each one of the points and then with the orange cone, just twist it back into position. So with this process, it gives us a lot of options. So say for example, we want these to connect, we can Dynamesh and fuse them together. Or maybe you just want it twirling around in a circle like this. What I tend to do is just arrange them in different ways. I'll then duplicate it so there's a second sub-object, and then I'll start to move them off the original. If you turn the curve resolution down a bit, it becomes far easier to move. Now you can see we've got this big twisting motion. So you can actually make quite long twists, which is quite cool. Now imagine you have multiple versions of this, they're all interacting with each other, and where, for example, the tips are showing, you can just tuck those in by getting the curve, maybe increasing the resolution, and then just making sure the inside goes inwards like this. And then you can have another piece that wraps on top of that. So we can try and do that here. I'm just going to duplicate this one, and then with move, I'm going to click customize on the cog and then come back to Gizmo 3D. Now with that Gizmo 3D, I can hold Alt and just reposition the center point here, and hold Alt just to make sure it's directed up the arm by moving these gizmos. Then what I can do is rotate this piece, maybe move it up a section, and now I can continue this in a unique way. I can just come back to customize, readjust those curves, or maybe just use the move brush to tuck it in if I'm more confident with that. So once you're happy with the generic layout, I usually just come in with move and then adjust these so they overlap in intricate ways. But you can see we've got all the original information we have there, so we don't have to repeat this process and sculpt everything. And say for example, you're not liking a certain bit of repetition, we can just come back over this and sculpt it away and give that variance. Usually what I like to do for this process is create about 3 or 5 versions of one asset. That means they're unique enough and I can just start to wrap these all across the hand. So if you look at the original reference, you could see how quick we can make this. The only difference with these leather straps is they'd be a little bit thinner, whereas ours are a bit more squared. Or if you like to be a bit more accurate with the geometry, you can just create those planes and sort of wrap them around and then use dynamic subdiv. My workflow process, I prefer to get the details and save a bit of time if you don't like the idea of hiding the ends. So each of the processes have different pros and cons. To be honest, I prefer to use this duplication method. So I have all the details with me and then I just hide the ends. That's just like a common games technique. So it saves me a lot of time in terms of workflow, but some people might be more comfortable and OCD about actually creating the wraps properly or the wires properly. So if that's the case and you're that person, you would just create the geometry and use dynamic subdivisions and then go back over and sculpt every surface of that. So it's up to you, it's up to you which one you choose. So thanks for watching that video. Hopefully you picked up some cool techniques when it comes to making arm wraps. We went through the process of masking up a particular area, splitting it into poly groups, and then adding subdivisions to it. That's a really cool method for doing it very quickly. Unfortunately, we have to sculpt each individual bit, but you remember what we can do is sculpt one of those strands and then start to duplicate it onto other areas. The other method we went through was simulating a bit of cloth and then positioning that with the bend curves. So really useful for the compression areas around the knuckles, for example. But you can use it on all manner of things. For example, on the third section, we actually physically used that to make leather straps that we could bend around the arm. So it's a really versatile way using those bend curves. If you enjoyed the video and want to come back to it later, leave a like so it's saved in your history. Also subscribe if you're interested in games art and becoming a better professional. Down links, we've got a Discord community where people are putting their works in progress. So thanks for watching and I'll catch you on the next one.